All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Made a point today to say that as clearly as possible, SaberSim's DFS Office Hours, because I've noticed watching my streams back the last couple days, I get on here sometimes and I'm just so excited to come on and start talking that I just rip through that really fast, and it ends up sounding like SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. So happy Friday, everybody. This is SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. We've got a fun stream here on tap here today. Quite a few questions in our queue. We'll talk about a couple things related to player exposures, player pool, curation kind of things. A couple notes on ownership projections. A little bit of contest selection strategy, which is always fun. We'll talk a little bit about adjusting team totals and how that affects the Sims. I know that we probably will have some new viewers here today, maybe not, but in case this is your first time watching, whether you watch this back as a recording or you're watching here live, this show is open Q&A. So if you have questions for me, pop them into the YouTube chat. If you're in SaberSim Slack, you can pop your questions into the Office Hours channel in Slack. And I answer questions in roughly the order they come in. So get your questions in early, and I will try to get to everything here today on today's stream. I wanted to start, though, with just a quick... I noticed this last night as I was building. I actually noticed this after. I noticed this too late, really, as I was building my NFL Showdown lineups for last night. And I just thought I'd talk about it a bit here on stream because I think it's interesting. We had an interesting situation with the Dalvin Cook news last night. So these are the projections we had for last night, SaberSim projections, right? And we assumed Dalvin Cook was not going to take the entire lion's share of the carries, right? We had somewhat of a split between Dalvin Cook and Mattison here. This is on DraftKings. So 13.5 points, 13.57 points for Cook, 11.97 points for Mattison. Assume some kind of a split timeshare. And I'm trying not to be results focused about this. That's not my intention here. But what I realized here, so I built my lineups, and as many of you guys probably got as well, built the lineups. Let's say we were just building 20 here, and we'll just see what we get out of this. But basically got no Cook or Mattison. Basically zero, right? And this mostly had to do with the pricing. The pricing was inefficient on these two players. And, well, it was inefficient assuming a timeshare on the two players. Both players were basically priced as if they were going to get all of the carries. And you essentially got none of either of them, right? We can see just in a 20 max, we have none of either. In the entire pool of 500, we got... Let's see. How much Cook? We got 20% in the entire pool of 500, and for Mattison, we got about 20%, right? And that's fine. I don't think this is necessarily wrong, right? If we assume that that's what's going to happen, I think that's a stance to play for the game. But I certainly think that it is a little bit more interesting when you're thinking about ceilings here to have basically assumed that either one of them was going to get the lion's share of the carries, right? What almost is the point of assuming a median outcome here for both of the guys, that they split the carries, that each of them would get 50%. It's almost like a hedge, right? Which is probably true if you're trying to accurately predict the mean outcome, or if you're building cash lineups, or on a main slate. If this game was one of 12 other football games and we had this unpredictable situations with the running backs, it makes sense to kind of approach it this way. But for Showdown, when you're just trying to predict like single game outcomes, I think, and I realized this after lock, and again, maybe I'm being a little results focused here. If we had gotten an even timeshare between these two guys, maybe we'd all be celebrating that, that we mostly faded them, right? But I think it almost makes more sense to have just assumed what is the best case scenario for either of these two running backs. Well, it's the other one basically being not involved in the offense, one way or the other. Whether Cook is out there as a decoy and Mattison basically gets the full workload, or what we had actually last night, which was Cook basically getting his full share, right? And when I talk, a lot of times there are questions on here of I want to make some adjustments to projections and I don't know how, or I don't know where to start. One of the things I always recommend people do is focus on a situation that is unclear. And we had a perfect example of that last night, right? There was There was a lack of clarity about this running back situation, even after Adam Schefter comes out and tweets, and he basically was exactly right. Dalvin Cook is going to get the lion's share of the carries. He's going to get his full workload, right? There was still uncertainty there. And I think in retrospect, having taken the approach of not completely fading either of these guys or completely removing their projection, but assuming that one of these guys is going to get 80% of the work, I think might have made more sense here to approach it that way. And maybe one way to do that, I was thinking here this morning, would be to kind of sum the total running back projection, right? Oops. And let's see, that would have been 13.57 plus 11.97, and then maybe give Cook 80% of that. So that's 20.4, which looks a little bit more of what his projection probably would have been if there was no injury concerns at all. So something like this for Cook, and then 25.54. Giving Mattison something like 5.1, right? You're going to get basically no Mattison here doing it this way. But projecting things this way, and then let's see what we get here. And I'm using Cook here as an example, which is super convenient, but I don't think process-wise there would have been anything wrong about going the Mattison direction here either. And building lineups this way. And then what you've done is you're optimizing kind of for an upside situation in the murkiest, the least clear situation about this game state, right? Now all of a sudden we're getting a lot of Cook captain. I'm sure he's popping up in our flex spot a lot in the lineups where he's not a captain. And I think this is maybe just a little bit more of an interesting way of thinking about this, right? We take the least clear situation about the game, the situation that models and projection systems are inherently going to struggle with addressing, and we kind of play an upside take on it. So something to look out for, something that I'm definitely going to look out for in the future here, of situations where when we have an injury situation, the projections are splitting the difference. And just thinking about, how likely is that outcome really? Or what do we stand to gain? Because when you're splitting the difference between the two, right, you actually are taking a stance. You're taking a stance that basically neither really makes sense to fit into lineups. It is as if either of them were projected for very little at all, almost no points, because at their salary, you can't play them unless one of them has that projection of being that high upside play. So something I was just thinking about last night a lot. I felt like it was very relevant because I always come on here and I talk about the best spots to add value to making adjustments to projections are situations that are inherently hard to model, that are unpredictable, maybe because of injury news or a trade or anything like that. And I just think that was a really good example, really good case study of when that comes into play here. So wanted to talk about that a little bit. But that is just my quick little rant to get this show started off. I see our stream numbers are jumping here now. So welcome everybody that is joining up joining the stream now. For those of you that missed it right at the start, I know, again, probably some newer viewers here today. This show's open Q&A. I answer questions that come in YouTube chat and in our Office Hours channel in Slack. I try to tackle questions in roughly chronological order here. And we'll talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. But let's hit it. Let's keep it rolling. So going to jump to some questions that came in Slack here. And this one's from Daniel. This came in early this morning here. And Daniel was wondering, I was running some test builds this morning for 3-man, but only getting Mahomes in all lineups. I even went back and lowered my ownership on him down to 1%, but still only getting him. Other than locking in a different QB in step 1, how can I get off him? So Daniel, if you end up seeing this, I sent you a message in Slack. I wasn't entirely sure what you're talking about in terms of the 3-mans, but what I was assuming, what it sounds like you're talking about, is like the 3-man winner-take-all type contests on either site. I think I know people play them a lot more on FanDuel, it sounds like. But they're basically cash contests, right? They're basically triple ups with just 3 people. So you'd be using your kind of cash sliders here. So let's just do that and see what we're getting out of this. And we don't need 150 lineups, but maybe we need 40 here. So we're using the cash lineups here. We'll see what we're getting out of this. And I would not be surprised if you're getting Mahomes in 100% of these. Because we're building for cash, right? I think at least at the moment, the SaberSim projections are pretty bullish on Mahomes for this weekend. I think he's probably going to end up likely being the cash QB this week, barring something changing. At least that's how it seems like the projections are kind of looking to this point. But we don't even need 40 lineups. Let's just see what we're getting out of this here. Okay, so actually we are getting, okay, so no. So the projections have come down a little bit. So at least on FanDuel, we're getting some variety with our quarterbacks here. It may be that actually we're seeing some variety with the quarterbacks here. Maybe on DraftKings, it's a little bit more FanDuel or a little bit more Mahomes focused. Overall, though, like I'd be happy to talk about how to avoid this anyway, right? Let's say you're running a cash build and you're getting 100% of a certain quarterback. Okay, so 3 max. So you're talking about like a 3 max GPP. Okay, let's do that instead. So first of all, let's say we're just running a 3 max, and Daniel, are you on DraftKings or FanDuel? I'm just curious. I might as well build on the site that you're referring to here. I suppose it doesn't really matter here, but we'll just do a build for a 3 max and see what we'll get. But I'll answer this question kind of in a general form of if you're getting players that you don't want, like what do you do? How do you avoid that? First of all, it's always good to remember that the builder's pushing you in that direction for a reason. Totally fine changing it up. Nothing wrong with making your own decisions, but especially if you were finding that, let's say you were building, I don't know. Let's say you're building cash lineups and all of your cash lineups had the same QB in it. That's probably a pretty good indication that that's the best overall projected QB. But should you want to change it, should you want to switch it up, these are the easiest ways to do it. So let's see what we get here. All right. So here we go. Yeah. So good example, right? We're building our lineups and we're getting 100% Mahomes, right? Easiest thing to do here is to just edit your max exposure. So maybe you only want one Mahomes lineup. Generally, in a pool of at least 500 or so, maybe we would just want one, right? In a pool of 500 or so lineups in a high variance sport like NFL, you are going to be able to get, let me change this to 34. There's going to be enough QBs in your pool that you can just set a max exposure and dial this in here. So maybe we only want one lineup with Mahomes in it, and we can just set a maximum exposure to 34. We resort through the rest of the pool, and we get some other lineups here with some Brady stacks coming in. If we don't want any Mahomes, we can just uncheck him here, and we won't get any Mahomes. The lineup pool, provided that you're building at least about 500 or so lineups, I would say in general, is going to be flexible enough to support this kinds of things. When you mentioned here that you lowered your ownership on him down to 1%, I want to make sure that you're doing this here in the right spot. Because I think this does create some confusion. So this my ownership column here is your ownership projection for the player. So if you change this to 1, what you're actually saying is you're projecting Mahomes is going to be 1% owned, and you're actually probably going to end up getting more of him than you would have otherwise. If you want to limit your exposure to a player before the build, you want to do that in the maximum exposure column. And in this case, you could set this to 1, which in effect is going to remove him from the pool. You could also set this to 34 and make sure he doesn't show up in more than one of your 3 max lineups. But of course, I think the easiest way to actually do this is to just build it without touching anything here on step 1 and to just make your adjustments in step 3 after you have a chance to see what the lineups are looking like. Because maybe after you see that the builder wants to give you 100% Mahomes, maybe you actually want to at least keep some of him or keep all of him. Maybe you don't. Either way, you still have the option to just uncheck him here. But so Daniel says, is step 1 better or wait till step 3? It's kind of a mix, right? I would always do your first build without touching anything on step 1, because then you get to see. It's a useful data point to see that SaberSim wants to give you 100% Mahomes in your 3 max lineups. Then you can decide to fade that, but at least you've had the opportunity to see it. If you do that in step 1 and you just removed him from your pool, you would never have gotten to see that the builder wants to use Mahomes this much anyway in the first place. So if you've decided that you're just going to fade him, you've run a test build, you see it, you're like, I get it. I know that SaberSim wants him to use it, wants me to use him, but I still don't want to. It's probably better, especially if you're building 150 or so lineups, to go back and remove him from your pool in step 1 and then rebuild. But for a 3 max, it's probably just fine to just do this. So let me know if that helps. Cool. Let's keep it going. All right, cool. So a question from TMB here. And it looks like there's some discussion here already going on in the chat, but we'll talk about this. TMB has kind of a unique approach, at least to how he's thinking about his exposure settings. He said, can a successful process before a slate, example NFL, be to run 1,500 lineups for the contest size you're playing to see the exposures at each position and stack type and team stacks, then set the number of lineups you're going to play, for example, 45, then go position by position and cap the exposure to the highest exposure that position got in the 1,500 build. Got it. Okay. That is, in a 1,500 lineups, the most exposed QB is 27%. So in 45 lineups, I cap it at 30%. If QB 1 plus 2 is 46% in 1,500 lineups, in my 45 lineups, I might cap them at 45 or 50%. And then also part of my process is adjusting team totals. What are your thoughts? Recently, I've been profiting $2 or losing half of my entries. Been doing this for a week now. Small sample, but just want insight if I'm on the right path. Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. So what TMB is saying he's doing is he's going in here, and let's just do this. Let's do a build here. So he's building this. He's building 1,500 lineups, right? And then viewing the entire pool, the full pool of 1,500, and using how often a certain player shows up in his pool of 1,500 per position, and kind of using that as a baseline. That's the maximum exposure I want to any one player on the slate, right? If the player that's showing up in my 1,500 lineups at running back most often is 30% or something like that, I don't want any running back owned more than 30% in my pool of lineups. The first thing that this is going to do is it is going to make you play very wide. You are going to have a wide player pool. You are not going to be heavily exposed to any one player. This is definitely going to lower your variance pretty significantly. And it does not surprise me if most often you are finding that your slate breaks out where you are kind of roughly floating around breaking even, right? You're like probably somewhere between losing 50% to like maybe doubling up, right? Because we're playing a pretty low variance strategy here. You've got amongst your 45 lineups or so, you're pretty widely exposed. This question to me ends up kind of being more about variance than actual strategy. If this is what you want your approach to be here, in terms of risk tolerance, I think it's fine. I think it's probably a little bit too wide for me, right? I don't know if I would want my highest owned plays to be just 30% owned. That's just my personal take. I'd like to actually be able to get measurably over the field on certain players. And sometimes those are even the highest owned plays, right? Like the chalkiest running back on the slate might be 30% owned. There are times where I want to be over the field on that player. I know this build is taking a second to run, but I want to let it finish so we can actually like kind of demo and walk through what is being done here. So that's the thing that immediately jumps into my mind. I have experimented with a similar process for a sport like baseball, mostly with hitters, where I've capped my exposure to any one hitter at the highest ownership projection for hitters on the slate, basically making the assumption it's a high variance position in a very high variance sport. And I'm basically making the assumption there that it is never appropriate to be over the field on the highest owned hitter on the slate, and that you might as well spread out, especially if you're playing 150 lineups or something like that, like I normally am. So again, I think this approach is probably like this is pretty low variance. This is playing a very wide strategy overall. So yeah, in this case, you would basically be saying something like, I'm not going to own any running back over 30%. I'm not going to own any wide receiver over 25%. I'm not going to have any quarterback over 12%, right? You're going to be very, very spread out. I would be, now that I'm seeing this and how this actually breaks out, I would be a little cautious with this. I think it's really going to make you spread out, and it's not going to allow you to get over the field on almost anybody. The one thing I would be a little cautious here with these stack types, mostly from the lens of viewing your entire pool, right? When you build an entire pool of 1,500 lineups, part of the point of building extra lineups and then sorting the best 150 out, right, is so that we can identify what the best lineups are, right? So like even in the pool of 1,500 lineups, we have some of these lineups that don't even have a stack at all. A lot of times they have running quarterbacks in them, like Lamar Jackson and stuff, right? But what happens here is that when we filter back down to 150 and identify the stacks, the builder kind of says, okay, of all these lineups we built, the best ones are actually the ones where we're building a QB stack. Well, if you used your exposure settings from your full pool of 1,500 here and said that I'm not going to have, any more than I don't know. I'm not going to have any more than 3% QB plus 3 with one run back stacks, right? You may be unnecessarily eliminating lineups that are actually pretty good in your pool from your pool here. So that's kind of my gut take on this overall. Personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with in general taking a very wide approach here on your player exposures. 45 lineups too. Like I think you're gonna be naturally pretty wide when you're playing 150 lineups. If you cut down to 20 or something like that, right? This is going to condense quite a bit. I think setting limits like these is gonna maybe unnecessarily widen your pool a little too much for me, but yeah. It's an interesting idea. And I think like at least kind of like thinking about this and going down this path of trying to kind of come up with something that's unique to your process that you are building yourself is a great idea. And let me know also TMB, like where this kind of came from. And I mean that in like, I mean that like totally honestly. I'm curious like what, a lot of times the best advice I can give when you're trying to think about building a process out on SaberSim is distance yourself from what you're doing, right? Don't say, this is literally the steps I'm taking. Is that right? And ask yourself, why are you doing the thing, right? If you follow this up by saying, I want to play a very wide approach and I want to have exposure to a ton of different players because I want to play in a way that minimizes my risk, basically, then I would say, well, maybe this actually works pretty well. Or if there was another reason you were doing this, if there was like a strategic reason or a reason to get leverage on certain plays or something like that, then I'd be interested in hearing that too. But the more you can say, I'm doing this thing, here's why I'm doing that. And does the why logically, or does the process logically follow from the why, the better I think the sharper you'll get over time. So, but good question. And I see some more questions showing up live here. So we'll get to everything, I promise. We've got a couple more questions that are in the Slack channel, so we're going to hit those first. Awesome question here from Toyo Driver about contest selection for NBA on FanDuel. So let's give this a second to load here. And, didn't want to send here. I'm praying my internet holds up today. If you've been watching the stream all week, there it is. We've had an internet blip every single day on stream, which is incredibly frustrating for me. So Toyo says, currently on FanDuel, playing the 25-cent fadeaway with a 20 max. Every once in a while, they bump it to 150. Playing the $1 SWAT 3 max while I further hone my process and build a bankroll. Having seen very positive results on ROI with break-even and profit nights. My question is, where's the next best direction to go in contest selection? Assuming a plentiful bankroll, would the $222 20 max be a good transition, even though it's under 20,000 entries? Or should I go into $3 to the $5 per entry GPP? That's 150 max. And on 150 max, is it worth trying with 20 lineups, or should you really try to max it to be competitive? My goal is to make a nice daily ROI, maybe quit my J job. Yeah, that's the dream. I'm still working on getting better on the other sports as well. SaberSim has helped me tons. Cool. So let's pull up the FanDuel lobby. Their contest mix is actually a little unique tonight. FanDuel is doing something that at least this season I haven't seen them do as much. Their flagship contest, like the big GPP, is more expensive. It's $15 and it's a lot smaller. Typically for NBA, they've been making the shot the clutch shot, and it's like normally a little over, it's almost like 80K plus entrance, and it's like $3 or $5. Tonight, it's just $3 and it's 150 max, and the main contest is the $15. So that's kind of weird. I do think overall, so I do think if you're looking for a next contest to go to, this 222 is pretty solid. It doesn't meet our effective entrance principles perfectly. There's only about 800 effective entrants in this contest, but it is under $3. So people with $1 million or more in lifetime winnings can't enter this contest, right? And I do think payout structure is pretty good on this contest as well. I think this is a good contest to play. So if you're playing the fadeaway, you're playing the you said the SWAT, the $1 3 max. This is a good contest to go. Obviously, all of the single entries and things like that, and most of the 3 maxes here are always going to grade out pretty well as well. So if you look at the single entry and you're looking to get some additional action down, the $2, the $5, the $10, at least those contests are all going to grade out very well from our contest selection principles as well. So mixing in some of those single entries can be a good idea. If you're interested in chasing the biggest prizes that are out there on a given slate, not so much tonight. I don't like this contest tonight, but when this contest is more $3 to $5 or whatever and 150 max, I actually think it's pretty good, especially when comparing to like this or comparing to what DraftKings has most nights for the big flagship GPP. I actually think it grades out pretty well. There's a lot of soft money in that contest. In terms of do you have to max it? You never have to max any contest, right? You're having, let's say you have a set of 20 lineups, right? And those lineups are set. The EV of those lineups is already defined and is not related to whether or not you're playing an additional 130 lineups in the contest or not, right? So you don't make your lineups as a whole better by just playing 150 lineups instead of 20 and not maxing the contest out. However, when you can, we always recommend people take the money that they're playing and invest it into as many entries as possible to smooth out your variance, right? So if you were playing 20 lineups in the big flagship GPP every night versus 150, you're going to have, it's going to take you longer to realize your expected value in that contest because you just have less shots at it. And the people in the contest that are maxing it out are going to have probably a bigger equity at a top prize in that contest than you do because they have more entries in the pool. But you shouldn't never necessarily feel like you have to max a contest out. So, but overall, if you're playing this contest, I do think a good jump is to the 222. Just keeping in mind that it is quite a big bankroll jump, especially if you've just been playing the fadeaway and the SWAT. That's like $8, right? I mean, this is, probably $50 or $60 to max out. So it's quite a big bankroll jump. So just make sure you're ready for it, right? And make that determination from your bankroll, not from your current ROI or anything, right? Because especially even from the start of the NBA season and now is a very small sample size and would be your ROI over that sample size would be very heavily swayed by how much, by one big bank or something like that. It's very easy to assume that you are more profitable than you are if you've had luck swing your way so far this season. So once you can safely play this contest and play 5% or less of your bankroll on a given slate, then I think it's a good contest to start mixing in. So, but let me know if that helps. Cool. All right, let's keep it going here. Devin, I see your question in Office Hours Slack as well. I will get back to that. I'm going to hit some of the questions that have come in live here on stream first. So this one's from Joshua. I know you answer Slack questions first, but if you get a chance, can you go over ownership projections and where to get most accurate? A lot of talk in Slack about that lately, specifically for NBA. So I talked a ton about ownership projections yesterday on stream on our YouTube channel here. And I'll give you a little bit here, Joshua. I'm not just going to send you off onto another video, but on our YouTube channel, as you scroll down here, there's this playlist, catch up on the latest Office Hours live streams. Yesterday's stream, I spent probably the first 20 or so minutes talking about how our ownership projections are made, what the strengths and weaknesses of the ownership projections are, where the best opportunities are to add value. I definitely go back and watch that. Because I just talked about it yesterday and I went into a lot more detail than I will be able to go into on today's show. With all that said, I know there have been some comments lately about the ownership model. There have been a couple nights where we've frankly been off on certain players, certain sites, especially for NBA. So we are planning on investing some time to make some improvements to the ownership model, especially towards the start of the year into January. So I would say look forward to that. If you are interested in more information on how the ownership projections are calculated, what our ownership model does very well, what it doesn't do so well, I'd go back and watch this, at least the first 20 or so minutes when I'm talking about it, because just talked about it yesterday. So, but the short of it is, for those of you that are watching here for whom I have your attention now and you aren't going to go watch that video, what we do is we take an aggregate projection and we build basically thousands of lineups with a very high variance setting, and the exposure of certain players in those lineups becomes the ownership projection. So what's very cool about this is it is an unbiased projection system, ownership projection system that operates using real lineups and can pick up on players that maybe just purely because of the way the lineup fits together and salary requirements and positional requirements maybe are going to be a little bit chalkier than somebody that was projecting ownership a different way would pick up on. The problem with that, and basically I would say the biggest overall weakness to the ownership model at the moment, is we don't pick up on narratives well. So like one of the big misses we had this week was under projecting Harden's ownership on FanDuel on Wednesday night, right? Our model can't pick up on the narrative of him going back to Houston and this kind of big moment that I think got steamed and talked about a lot throughout the day. And we ended up under on his ownership projection on FanDuel. But planning on making some more improvements there. All right, cool. Lord Pie, NBA question here. After doing some research, let's say I have a strong opinion that a particular game, okay, I remember you were asking this yesterday in Slack, has a chance to be an exceptionally polarizing score, over 230 or under 190. On a smallish slate like last night, 3 games where this opinion could be exceptionally significant, how would you approach building lineups that play to these two opposite possibilities? On a max 150 lineups, would you run one build for 75 lineups and the high over, and then another build for 75 lineups and the low under? So the one thing about this, I guess the short answer is yes, I would do it that way. But I would be a little cautious. So NBA games in general, just like the players are, right? The players themselves are generally pretty normally distributed, right? So the most common outcomes are going to center around the mean. The games are that way as well. The most common outcomes for NBA games are generally also going to center around the mean, the average outcome for the game. So, like statistically speaking here, just on the range of outcomes, it is unlikely that we would actually see a situation where the most common outcomes were the extreme under or the extreme over, unless you were talking about a game whose range of outcomes was just very wide, where the standard deviation of that game's outcomes was extremely wide, and you basically had like a very flat curve where it was like very, very, very flat, right? But in that case, the most common outcomes are still most likely to be still likely to be the middle outcomes there. So I would be a little careful with this premise basically here of a game actually having an outcome curve where it looks like where the most common outcomes are the low end or the high end. Now, if you're saying, I think the biggest leverage spot on the slate strategically is thinking about, especially on a 3-game slate, is thinking about this particular game going way under or way over, that's fine. If you wanted to approach it that way, I would do exactly what you said. I would adjust the team totals here and say, maybe you say you had the same stance about Sacramento, Charlotte, and maybe you give them a big drop down in one case, maybe like 10 points less on both teams here. So you drop the team totals to like 106 and 104 and apply these changes and let the projections update and build 75 lineups here. Right. And we're seeing like relatively big drops for all of the players playing in this game. And then you do another one where you make an adjustment and say, now it's 126 to 124 or something like that. Right. And have this opposite approach and build 2 different lineup sets. From there, since you're going to have 2 different lineup sets, you're going to have to manually export those lineups and load them into your entries file by hand. We don't have any way at the moment in the entry editor to take 2 separate sets of 75 lineups and combine them into the same 150 max contest. So you have to do that by hand. I think also, if we do this for the first game on the slate, all is good and well. But if you did this for the last game on the slate, you're also probably going to complicate your late swap process quite a bit as well, because you're going to need to specifically late swap lineups separately based on what your total premise was for the game. So that's the way you would do it on a kind of practical level. I think you have the right idea of making the adjustments and then building lineups in separate sets. But I would be cautious with this thinking overall, because I think the ranges of outcomes for these NBA games frequently don't actually look that way. A way of doing this on I guess last thing I'll say on this is that in a lot of ways, the default sliders for a 3-game slate are going to kind of try to try to approach the slate this way, right? Because sim variance is going to be so high. So when sim variance is at like 9 or 10, the impact of games, not just players, right, but games showing up on their super wide range of outcomes, right? The individual game sims you get is going to be magnified. Like if we have a game outcome where Denver and San Antonio goes to double overtime, it goes way over, right? And you're building lineups where each lineup is built from a single game simulation, like you would be if sim variance was at 10, right? You will have a lineup that represents that outcome. But if sim variance was at 4, that game outcome would just be a part of a much bigger bucket of game simulations, and it will have a smaller impact on that individual lineup. So in effect, what happens, and the reason why the sliders are set such that sim variance is so high on your 3-game slates, right, is to have that effect, right? I want to consider a very wide range of outcomes for these games because there's only 3 of them on the slate. I want to play very high variance. I want to play high upside. So you naturally do get this effect a little bit here with the sim variance slider. Some of this doesn't need to be manually done. So hopefully I kind of helped cover that a little bit here. But if you have any follow-up questions, let me know here. Happy to dive in a little bit further. So let's see. Question from Easton here. Easton and company. Is there a way to limit how many goalies in soccer showdown lineups? Have always just went, I want max 1 in the opto. Interesting question. So I get the feeling that this is probably coming from Run Pure here because I don't think we have soccer projections on our app here. We don't. Let's see. Is there a way I can do the salary defaults? I don't have a way of doing this. Okay, I'm going to demo this here of how I'll do it, but I'm going to use NFL as an example because I don't have soccer projections on here to work with. There's not a way to set a rule to do it, unfortunately. What I would recommend doing here is, let's say we were doing yesterday's football slate. Give this a second to come back up. All right, let's just borrow the build here from before. So the easiest way to do it is to make use of our filters here and identify specific lineups that have combinations of players and then remove them from your pool. So you can say, let's say, for example, that we wanted to avoid, I think there was actually a question I talked about yesterday where somebody wanted to avoid having both quarterbacks in a showdown lineup. So what you can do is select lineups that have Ben Roethlisberger and Kirk Cousins, and then you can uncheck these lineups from your pool. So you can uncheck them here and then fill back in. And now we should avoid lineups that have both of those 2 players in the contest. Sometimes it's best to double check and make sure you didn't fill back in here with another lineup that actually does have Kirk Cousins and Ben Roethlisberger, but in this case we didn't, so we should be all good to go there. But yeah. So on the NFL side, while we're talking about this, since I have the opportunity to do this, so we don't have soccer sims at the moment. But on the NFL side, or for the sports that we do have simulations for, one thing I will say is that typically the reason you want to do this is to try to capitalize on a certain game script or game outcome, right? And on a traditional tool like Lineup HQ or other optimizers out there, all the builder is going to do is going to optimize lineups for you based on average projection, and it leaves you to be the one to come up with the game scripts and also the optimal lineups for when those game scripts take place, right? With SaberSim, since we have actually simulated out all of these, the game, or in this case, the game play-by-play thousands of times, every lineup you're actually looking at here represents an individual game simulation from our database of sims. So when you are getting Ben Roethlisberger and Kirk Cousins, for example, in the same lineup together, it's not because they just project well enough and fit salary-wise into that particular lineup. It's because there is a game simulation in our sim database where those 2 players are optimal together. So it is a little bit of a pivot, and I would say in general, the rules that you may have had to use for Showdown in the past with other tools, you don't have to do here, which is why a lot of the rules frankly don't exist. Now, it's totally fine to say, I don't want to play any Justin Jefferson lineups, right? But what's actually happening here with SaberSim is you're saying, just give me a set of 20 lineups where Justin Jefferson is not the optimal captain. I want to play that angle on this slate. You're not just removing Justin Jefferson as a captain and we're just eliminating lineups where he happened to project well enough to fit in. You're actually removing game simulations, really, and optimals for game simulations where he's the optimal captain and finding leverage elsewhere on the slate. So it's really powerful. It's kind of a big shift. And if you are wondering where are all the player groups? Where are the player rules? Where are those kinds of things? We do have a lot of rules, right? There are a lot of stacking rules and settings that you can change and mess around with here. And there's a ton of different things you can do. But the rules, the actual like player group rules and these combination rules and things like that you may have had to use on different optimizers to build good lineups, you literally just do not have to do here because the lineups that are being produced are from simulations. So, but I'm sure I will be talking about that a bunch more here as we continue to move along. Okay, actually, so this is like a perfect example here of the next of another similar question. So Cryptic Kevin says, is there any way to set limits on players of certain ownership? And then followed that up by saying, is there a way to set constraints on number of players in each lineup that fall within a range of projected ownership? For example, exactly 1 under 5%, 3 or at least 3 and a max of 4 under 10%, etc. Yeah. So another reason why these rules exist on a lot of other traditional optimizers is because these optimizers don't know how to deal with ownership very well. They are going to optimize you lineups that are just average, the best average projection lineup it can. They don't understand ownership. So we set rules like this to force certain players into your lineup to basically say, okay, I know that the optimizer is just going to optimize for average projection, but I want to not just have all the highest owned plays in there, right? Our approach to ownership is actually a little bit different. We handle it completely through our ownership fade slider. So I'll explain how this works. So the ownership fade slider shows up here when you set your contest specifics, and it is back tested to a certain value. Let me make sure I'm not missing any questions coming in here. It's back tested to a certain value based on what we have determined gives you the highest expected value lineups for your particular contest. And what it does is when we build each individual lineup, we'll grab the random set of sims we're using for that set of lineups based on the sim variance slider. We'll take the points that those players scored in that particular set of sims, right? And then change that number based on whether or not that player is over or under-owned compared to the average at their particular position and make an adjustment there based on that player's ownership projection, right? And again, this changes if you're playing a single entry, right? We don't care about ownership as much, right? We don't need to fade as much ownership in a single entry. If you're playing the Millie Maker, we need to care about ownership quite a bit more, right? These things change as the contest changes, right? So we will build lineups that are basically kind of making the upside versus ownership adjustment on the fly per sport, per site, per contest that you tell us you're playing. So if let's build some lineups for the main slate coming up this week. And you'll kind of see that the lineups that you are getting here kind of have this balanced approach to ownership overall. Now, you're going to see some lineups where you have 6 players under 10% owned, right? You're going to have those are going to be lineups that probably have a little bit lower of an average expectation, but have a very high expected value when they get there. There might be lineups that only have 1 player under 10% owned. And in that case, yeah, you're going to be a little chalkier. You probably have a lineup that has a little bit of higher average performance. But in spite of the fact that that lineup has a little bit of a higher ownership, it's still what we feel is a profitable lineup for the contest. So we'll see this here in a second, how this actually ends up working. But what this is less about taking a tool that's not even designed to think about upside and then force an ownership limit on it to make it think about ownership. This SaberSim is actually smart enough to think about ownership dynamically on a per contest, per slate level. So let's see. So we can see here, right? We didn't set any ownership kind of rule at all. We're playing probably one of the chalkiest stacks on the slate, but we've balanced it out by including some of these players that are coming in a little bit lower owned, right? Similar here. Getting some lower owned plays in here. Right? And it's on a per lineup level. Sometimes we have lineups here that we can use the sort and we can see that in this pool of 500, we have a lineup that is as highly owned as 127% ownership. And we have a lineup that is as lowly owned as 43% ownership, right? But it's all been kind of adjusted here for the contest that we're playing. So with that said, you can definitely still kind of, make adjustments. You can remove uncheck lineups that have a certain amount of ownership or don't in your pool here. Man, all of a sudden I'm getting spammed a lot. Cool. So that's our approach to ownership projections. Definitely a little, or not projections, but ownership in lineups. So definitely a little bit more unique there. But Ryan said SaberSim really liked Conchar as a value play last night, under 10% on DK, and that allowed you to fit in a lower owned Gobert and Jokic and LeBron together. SaberSim is so good at finding undervalued players. Yeah, I had a fair bit of Conchar as well. Yeah, I think a lot of times, especially on small slates, those somewhat not really no name, not necessarily just trying to diss John Conchar here, but Dylan Brooks gets ruled out, right? And all of a sudden you take the team that was probably the best source of value on the slate already and make them even a better source of value. And then everybody jumps onto D'Anthony Melton and Desmond Bane, and Jaren Jackson Jr. was like 75% owned, right? But forgetting that there's generally some punts there that like have some level of upside for their salary, which like Conchar was the perfect example of. And that can fail too, right? That can go pretty badly the other direction, but yeah, worked out last night for sure. So Daniel says you have the bad QB league on FanDuel, but unable to build lineups. That's not something we're planning on supporting. I think that's kind of just like a meme contest on FanDuel. I can't even imagine their contests are very good for that, right? It seems like kind of just like a for fun. Yeah, it's mostly just kind of for fun. We're not planning on supporting this. In fact, I think we were supposed to plan on removing this from the app just so people didn't accidentally try to build lineups. So I'll see what the status is there. We're not planning on supporting this. If you want to play this, I would just have some fun with it, as opposed to trying to like optimize perfectly for the contest, because I don't even know how long they're going to keep it going. It seems like it's mostly just for fun. So Joshua said, I'm always scared to mess with anything in step one because I feel like it's taking away from what SaberSim is trying to do. Yeah, again, if that's the case, there's nothing wrong with making more of your adjustments in step three, where you are playing with a set of lineups that we think are already viable for the contest, right? Like if you're like, man, I think Austin Eckler is getting over-owned here this week, and I kind of want to fade him, but he's projecting so well and I don't want to touch anything, right? Like you can feel empowered to like uncheck him here in step three, and all that's going to happen is we're going to sort through the pool of 500 lineups that we already think is viable here, right? These are optimized for the contest you tell us we're playing, and give us our favorite 20 that don't include Eckler. Whereas it's a much more aggressive stance if you do that on step one. Nothing wrong with doing that in step one either, right? It's just a more aggressive stance. So I would say if you're a little bit nervous, or you're still getting familiar with how to think about some of this stuff, the more adjustments you can make in step three, the safer you're going to be overall. So Aaron says, quick question. Would you fade early games with possible big late injury news, knowing you didn't get any core plays in the early games with some test builds to show that? Yeah, I think that's fine. Especially if we have a situation, let's jump back to NBA, especially if we have a situation where there is big late news in the late games, right? I don't think we do tonight. Let's check the basketball monster tab here. I was looking earlier and I don't think there's like a big questionable player. Oh, actually, no, we do. Yeah, so we've got like Ayton and Schroeder questionable in the late games. AD's questionable late. So this has changed a bit. So, on this particular slate, it's probably not the best time to do that, because both, I think the Sacramento and Charlotte game and the Brooklyn and Atlanta game, you're going to get a ton of guys from. Those are both going to be really popular. So I wouldn't jump at fading them tonight necessarily. But if you were running, I know there was like a slate last week where it was just one game early. It was like Philly and Orlando at 7 p.m. Eastern. The total of that game was like 200. And you basically would get like almost none of those guys early. And that was the only early game. And then there was a bunch of late news. In that case, if you ran a test build to see like, I'm not getting a lot of these guys anyway, I'm going to just X them out of my pool to maximize my late swap flexibility, I think that's a great strategy. But always, always, always you want to start with a test build. Because if we run a test build here, you're going to see we're going to get a ton of Sacramento and Charlotte and Brooklyn and Atlanta players here. So Yeah, I mean, we're clearly digging Nick Richards at the moment, which value play. We'll see how that works out. But like a lot of Charlotte, right, showing up here, some Atlanta. So like this isn't a game that I would want to just X either of those games. But Joshua says, I used to hate having lineups with 100% ownership on a player, but when that player goes off, just know that all of your lineups are in the dance. Yeah, I mean, and I think it depends a little bit too on how many lineups you're playing, right? If you have one lineup, you have to be 100% on everybody. If you play 3 lineups, right, you only have 4 different discrete exposure settings you can be on a player. You can be 100%, you can be 66%, you can be 33%, or you can be 0, right? If you're at 100, and then there's also the number of lineups. If you're at 150 lineups, right, being all in on a player means something very different than being all in on a player on 3 lineups. So that's something else that SaberSim will kind of adjust for you based on the sim variance slider, right? If you are playing a 3 max, your sim variance slider is going to come down. You're more likely to be 100% owned on a player. Same with 20. But if you go to 150 max, you're going to have a much higher variance set of lineups. You might only be 50% exposed to your highest owned player. So Red Sox says, Thursday Night Football recap question. Why after news broke about Dalvin didn't projections / the optimizer not have him at least in flex? My builds completely had him on the outside. Captain in flex. I updated often before and after lock. No Dalvin, but it did fade. I assume Mattison some. Dalvin destroyed me. Didn't do GPP because of that, so I pivot over to cash. Miss as well because of Dalvin Steelers' fourth quarter garbage time stats. Yeah, I talked about this for about 10 minutes here at the start of the stream. So I'd go back and check the beginning of the stream out because I think there's kind of an interesting strategy there. I mean, the reason why things were roughly the same is that our sims kind of took, based on the data that we had for this game, it kind of took a kind of middle outcome for these guys, right? We basically assumed that Dalvin Cook was maybe not going to be 100% handling his normal load, and that Mattison was still going to be involved. So let me reset the projections, right? That's basically what the sims were saying here. Now, what I always talk about here on stream is that situations where there is a big injury or there is murkiness or cloudiness or whatever, right, are the situations where they're inherently difficult to model and can be some of the best spots to make adjustments. And I think from a game theory standpoint, I missed this last night too. I didn't do this, but I think from a game theory standpoint, and this is kind of what I talked about at the beginning of the stream, I think it made a lot of sense to go all in on either Cook or Mattison, and to basically take 80% of the combined running back projection and just give it to one of these guys. Because that at least would be optimized for one upside situation. If the actual outcome that we got in the game last night was this, you wouldn't have used either player, and you're not really optimized for upside there either way, right? So I think it's an interesting idea and something that I want to think about more in the future. If this game was just part of a main slate, this might have been the best approach to take, is to just allow this situation to be a little cloudy, split the difference, and go play better running backs on other teams. But for a showdown, it probably made sense to be optimized for upside here and to pick one of these guys. I don't think process-wise, if you told me you had 100% Mattison because you gave the running back projection to Mattison, I don't think that would be wrong either. You just would have lost, right? If you gave it to Cook, you probably would have had a pretty good night. And I think from a game theory standpoint, it made sense to kind of go one way or the other there. And I missed that too. But these situations are hard to project, right? Just given by the fact that Dalvin Cook was like 25% owned last night, you can just know this was something that everybody around the industry was struggling with. Some people got on him. A lot of people didn't. Dalvin Cook, if everything was totally normal and he was perfectly healthy, right, he wasn't going to be 25% owned. And he certainly wasn't going to be 6% owned at captain. So this is a situation that's inherently hard to model. A lot of different projection systems are going to struggle with this, which is why when people come on here, now I'm basically rehashing what I said at the start of the show, but that's okay because I know a lot of you guys weren't here yet. A lot of models are going to struggle with this. And I always recommend when people come on and say, Jordan, where do I start with editing projections? What should I look at first? Like what do I even start? Start at the situations where there's a lack of clarity. There's uncertainty, right? And even if you don't even have to think about it from trying to be the most accurate, right? Think about it more from the standpoint of how can you be the most profitable? What's the biggest upside situation? In this situation, I think the biggest upside play was to play either of these guys and assume that the other one was basically not going to be involved, because then you at least kind of had a stance. What we ultimately ended up doing, and anybody that built lineups with SaberSim last night, there wasn't even a big difference of this compared to this, right? Because they were, for their price, splitting the difference between the two of them was basically getting 0. So if you wanted to get 0, right, like you could have, and if you had done this, then it would have made sense to do things like probably like this, right? And this. And that would have been a fine stance too. But I think as it were, because of the uncertainty in the injury situation with Dalvin Cook last night, the projections basically just hedged. And I don't think that's the fault of the Sims or anything. I think it's a hard situation to model. It's a hard situation to simulate. But from a game theory standpoint, I think it was suboptimal. And I made the same mistake. That's why I talked about it right at the start of the stream, because it's tough. So Don said, in NBA DFS, I've sometimes unchecked players that I did not want to use in my lineups. Is that not a good strategy? That's perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that. I would just say make sure that that's coming from a place of some like, I don't know. I would say, here's what I would say. I would say nothing wrong with removing players from your pool, but start by not doing that. Run a test build to see what the builder's giving you. And if a player that you were planning on unchecking is showing up in 75, 80, 90, 100% of your lineups, maybe it's a good opportunity to go double check that. You don't have to still use that player. That's fine. Maybe, but if you said, I'm fading the Lakers tonight, well, maybe just check on that, right? Like clearly the Sims seem to like Lakers. Do a little bit more research about the game. And maybe if you have an argument that you say, I mean, it could be as simple as I think the game's going to blow out. I don't know if the Lakers are going to blow out the Thunder at home, to be completely honest, but maybe you do. And you want to uncheck them, then that's fine. But if you're unchecking players that are showing up in the Sims a lot, you're basically disagreeing with the model, which the model's not perfect. Maybe you're doing it from a leverage standpoint. Maybe you say, yeah, no, I think the Lakers are in a good spot, but I think they're all going to be over-owned, so I'm fading them. That's also fine. But start with a test build so you can at least see what the slate looks like. Because this is a little bit of an easier way, I think, to visualize the slate by seeing what actual lineups are looking like and what exposures to players are looking like, right? Than this, personally. This is so much information, right? This is like, where do you even start? There's so much. When you build a test build, you can see how everything's fitting together in actual lineups and then make some determinations on players you don't want in your pool. So, Young Stunna says, if I try to make adjustments in step 3, it always tells me I need to add more players to my pool. If that's happening, the reason why is because you've made enough adjustments in step 3 that we can't find 20 lineups in your pool of 500 that fit everything. So if you are seeing that particular message, it's best to go back to step 1 and make some adjustments here. Either remove some of the players that you've been Xing out from your pool in step 1. If you were locking players into your pool, lock them in here, right? So if you wanted to fade the Lakers and you wanted to lock Giannis and so on, right? Do that here. If you were finding that you were significantly reducing your exposure to certain players, maybe you drop their projections down here. If you were higher on certain players, maybe you increase their projections here, right? And then we'll build you a much better pool of lineups that is more representative of how you want to tackle the slate in step 3. So. Okay, cool. There was one question that had come in through support that I forgot about up until now. So let me go grab that here. And I should, honestly, it would have fit in really well when I was talking about adjusting team totals, because it is about adjusting team totals, but that's okay. It's not. Let's see. All right. So this question says, in terms of how the simulator works, if I change the projected score of a game, would this cause a new set of game simulations to run, or would the projections simply be altered? For example, if I bump Dallas to 30 points and Washington to 28, let's go do that, to target a shootout, would the simulator try to completely resimulate the game, or would the fantasy point projections from the previous sims get boosted proportionately? Yeah, so let's do this, and let's do this. So this is actually really cool, and maybe for those of you that are just using SaberSim for the first time here, it's pretty cool how this works. So what we actually do is if you update the projections for this particular game, we will remove certain games from our set of sims until the mean outcomes for both teams matches the new value, right? So Dallas before has a mean value, their average outcome in our simulations of 26.1 points. If we change this to 30, we are basically going to remove probably the lower end of outcomes mostly, right? A set of lower end of outcomes so that their mean becomes 30 points. Whoops, That didn't work. And then what we do after that, those sims have been purged a little bit here, is that we will update the projections for the players so now that their individual projections match the game sim in question, right? So it's pretty cool. So we don't run new sims. We're not re-simming this game. You're using the same set of sims as you would have been otherwise, but you're using a smaller set of game simulations that target this particular game outcome. So it can be a really cool way to do this. And like leverage a high or target a particular segment of a set of game simulations to target a particular game outcome. So a really, really powerful tool. If you don't have a sense so much on certain players, right? And also the other thing that's worth noting is like this will work both ways. So if you only bumped Dallas, right, that's actually going to have an effect on the Washington football team as well, because they're playing in that game, even though you didn't change the team total for Washington. So it works both ways. The one thing to be careful of here is that because this does essentially like limit the sims that can be chosen, is if you choose like really extreme outcomes for these games, you can see some kind of weird behavior, right? Like if you told me that you adjusted this to 55 and 52, right? The set of game simulations where this outcome actually happens is so low, so rare that you're really significantly limiting your sims at that point to choose from. And if you wanted to do this, I would instead take a more moderate approach and maybe bump it just up to like something that's a little bit closer, like maybe what we had in question here. And then increase your exposure to players in playing in that game as you need in step 3. So in other words, try to still think about averages here, right? You don't want to necessarily put the absolute ceiling outcome or the absolute floor outcome up here, right? But maybe you put like the average outcome, assuming that this game shoots out more often than not, and you'll get a better result doing it that way. So if you're like, what are you even talking about, right? Take the Spark Notes is take a light touch first. Start with a 10% bump of both teams, right? So a 10% bump here for Dallas might be increasing their points by 3. 10% bump for Washington might be increasing their points by 2. Start there, run a build, see what you get, see if you're happy with it, and then come back. If you're not happy with it, you didn't get enough this game, another 10%, 32, 27. Keep going from there. So, but good question. I know this one was one that came in through support. So Josh, not sure if you're watching me live here today, but I will get you a time-stamped recording to this part of the stream where I tackled this question, and let me know if you have any follow-up there. So, all right, cool. So Devin says here, can you touch quickly on your MMA process? Yeah, I'd be happy to. I will say this. I was playing MMA a ton last spring. I've cooled on it a little bit. Mostly I just kind of have been a little bit busier on Saturdays here. And especially in NFL season, I feel like I end up spending a lot of my time, I'll be playing the NBA slate most of the time anyway on a Saturday. And then a lot of times I'm like already so excited and thinking about football that sometimes these MMA slates kind of pass me by. But it looks like we probably have a pretty good card for this weekend. So I actually kind of end up thinking about MMA a little bit similarly to how I think about NFL Showdown. Oh, Josh is here. All right. Right on. Perfect. Cool. For MMA, I actually end up thinking about things a little bit from the lens of similar to how I do for NFL Showdown, where I'm less concerned about thinking about ownership and things like that. And I know I'm seeing that our ownership projection's missing for Silva. We'll get that worked out. But I'm less concerned about thinking about ownership more from the standpoint of like finding leverage on the field, and more I'm thinking about how can I build unique lineups and how can I avoid duplication. So I've experimented with doing things a variety of different ways. So first of all, I will say this. I like to be very aggressive with my sliders here. We don't have defaults for MMA at the moment. They just default to 0 and 0 because we don't have simulations yet for MMA. These are just kind of raw projections. All of that's coming. Simulations are coming for MMA. But for now, I play very aggressively with both my ownership fade and my randomness because it's a very high variance sport. I want to differentiate from the field. And also, I typically end up bringing this down and sacrificing some lineups at the high end of the salary band to get lineups that are different. That's kind of like at the baseline when I'm not making a lot of adjustments here overall to my lineups. At the very least, one thing I like to do is just play aggressively with both ownership and randomness. And again, this is probably going to have a weird result because we have the highest projected fighter on the slate projected for 0 ownership. But I like to use this as a bit of a baseline. Another thing that I have been doing, and I will just kind of like say what I was doing because I'm not going to be able to show it as much, is in the interest of trying to kind of find a little bit of leverage on the field. Yeah, so we're getting 100% silver because ownership is cranked. But we will get lineups that are a little bit diversified. I think one thing you can do here is actually go through and hand pick and look for lineups. I do the same thing in Showdown here, but especially if you're playing 20 or less, look for lineups that include combinations of players that are going to be very lowly owned, right? Especially if you have like all I'm really trying to do is be unique. So if there are combinations, again, the silver projection's messed up right now, but if there are combinations of players where they're both sub 10% owned, right? I love that because I know it means I'm going to get a very low owned, or it's going to get me a lineup that's a very low chance of being duplicated. The one other thing that I have experimented with, and again, this is the thing that I'm going to have to tell more than show because I don't really have a good way to bring this up. This is something that I do outside of SaberSim. Is I have taken I will take Vegas odds and basically convert them into implied probabilities of a fighter either winning or winning by knockout, and then comparing that to the ownership projection to see if I can find a fighter that the field is overvaluing. Right. For one reason or another, maybe their actual chance of winning the fight is quite a bit lower than their ownership projection indicates. And I will mess around a little bit there with taking very aggressive stands if I can find 1 or 2 fighters that I think are getting overvalued or undervalued. I mean, in my experience, what I was finding here, is that fighters with a very good chance to win their fight, but a relatively much lower chance to win by decision, either a knockout or a submission, often end up over-owned relative to their chance of actually showing up in the winning lineup. They project well based on average projections because their chance of winning is so high, but if their chance of winning by decision is lower compared to their ownership projection, I have found personally that those fighters often end up going over-owned. So, I also, on the contest selection side of things, I would say I would be cautious of fight cards that have less than 12-ish fights, especially when you start to get down to like when there's COVID stuff going on, 9 or 10 fight cards. It gets really hard to build good lineups that aren't going to be duplicated, and those are the cards that I really typically end up skipping completely. I don't know. Do we actually have 15 fights still on? It looks like this Matt Schnell here maybe is canceled. I don't know. This actually looks like a pretty good card if we have 15 fights and some of these names that are on here. I haven't really looked at MMA a lot recently. Again, I haven't been playing as much. I know there's a couple of you out there that are always asking for my golf takes and my MMA takes. And unfortunately, both of those sports I've been playing a little bit less lately. But mostly because I think also because NBA is such a grind. Like NBA is like an all night activity. So it makes it a little bit harder to add other sports in there. And also it's not really the peak time for golf, but anyway, that's kind of a rough process here. Kevin says, what about NBA DFS? Good question, Kevin. I won't be able to break down my entire NBA DFS process on stream right now. I would recommend, I'll put you in the direction of a couple resources. So on our YouTube channel here, we actually have a whole NBA DFS course that me and Max and Andy basically put together the whole thing. Starts with like contest selection and then what we feel are the 4 keys to beating NBA. I have a whole video about late swap, cash games, NBA Showdown, how we make our NBA projections. And then this video is probably the one that will be most interesting to you. This is an hour-long video of Max Steinberg, one of our pros here, actually literally recording the process that he was doing the hour leading up to lock to build his lineups on both DraftKings and FanDuel for a slate that took place 3 weeks ago. And then we had a follow-up video where we did like an AMA and people asked him a bunch of questions. So that will break down like Max's full NBA process and basically everything there is to think about my NBA process as a whole. The spark notes of it is that I love late swap. I am a late swap fanatic. And that I basically do the best I can to get my lineups in the best contest possible that I explain in the first video of the lesson. And then most of the time, I'm just praying for the opportunity to late swap and find the opportunity to take advantage on a field that's not going to bother to do it. But recommend joining into some of these other streams here and watching this show every day. And you will probably get the opportunity to see my NBA DFS process get pieced together that way as well. So, but that is going to be it for today. Our 10-minute long stream here today. Good stream. Had a lot of interesting things to talk about here. We talked about some player pool curation on both steps 1 and 3. Talked about ownership again a little bit. Talked about MMA here at the end. Contest selection for NBA. All kinds of stuff. So I do this show every Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So it is Friday here today. We'll be back here again on Monday. So hope to see you guys all then. In the meantime, enjoy the slate tonight. Enjoy the NFL slate coming up on Sunday here. And we'll see you guys on Monday. See ya.